Would you take a job if the instructions included, do not acknowledge the children playing after midnight, or absolutely no flash photography after 3 a.m., even if you hear voices? I did. My first night shift at this isolated RV park is proving to be a descent into the absurd, and I'm documenting every unsettling moment. Are you brave enough to see what happens when I try to follow these bizarre rules? The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled in what could generously be called a parking lot. Dust clouds swirled in my headlight beams, creating ghostly shapes that danced and disappeared into the Nevada darkness. The sign reading Desert Winds RV Park hung at a precarious angle, one corner held up by nothing but rust and stubbornness. Paint peeled from its surface like dead skin, and several letters have faded completely, leaving gaps that made it look like a mouth missing teeth. My name is David Torres, and 3 days ago I was desperate enough to take a job I found on a sketchy employment website. Night caretaker position, isolated location, decent pay, no experience necessary. The posting had been up for exactly 12 minutes when I applied, which should have been my first red flag. The second should have been how quickly they called me back. The third should have been the fact that they hired me over the phone without even asking for references. But desperation makes you ignore red flags. My last job had ended badly. Let's just say mixing customer service with anger management issues doesn't create the most stable career path. The eviction notice taped to my apartment door had given me exactly 14 days to come up with 3 months' rent, and this job promised to solve that problem in a single week. Now, sitting in my 15-year-old Honda Civic and staring at what looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie, I wondered if dying of starvation might have been the more dignified option. The RV park stretched out before me like a graveyard of vacation dreams. Empty concrete pads sat in neat rows, connected by cracked asphalt roads that disappeared into the darkness. A few scattered light poles cast sickly yellow circles that only seemed to make the shadows deeper. In the distance, I could make out the silhouettes of what might have been abandoned RVs, or possibly just large rocks. In this light, it was impossible to tell. The office sat directly in front of me, a squat building that looked like it had been constructed from spare parts and bad intentions. A single light glowed in the window, and I could see a hand-painted sign that read, "Night Caretaker. Check in here." The paint looked fresh, as if it had been made specifically for me. I killed the engine and immediately regretted it. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. No insects chirping, no distant highway noise, no wind through the sparse desert vegetation. Just an absolute, unnatural quiet that made me want to start the car again just to break it. Instead, I grabbed my backpack and walked toward the office, my footsteps echoing off the empty buildings with an intensity that seemed impossible. Each step sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, and I found myself walking on my toes to minimize the noise, though I couldn't have said why. The office door was propped open by a brick, which struck me as odd considering we were in the middle of nowhere. Who was expected to wander in? The interior was exactly what I'd expected from the exterior. Mismatched furniture, wood paneling for the 1970s, and a lingering smell of cigarettes and industrial carpet cleaner. A desk lamp cast a circle of warm light over a scattered collection of papers. And pinned to a corkboard behind the desk were dozens of Polaroid photos of RVs and their occupants, all smiling and holding up peace signs or thumbs up. The photos were old, their colors faded to sepia tones, and something about the forced cheer in those faces made my stomach twist. But what dominated the desk was a manila envelope the size of a small book, with Night Caretaker materials, David Torres, written across it in block letters. Someone had used a red ink stamp to mark important across the corner, and below that, in smaller letters, read immediately. I picked up the envelope, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside was substantial. The seal had been broken and retaped several times, as if different people had added materials over the years. When I opened it, a collection of papers spilled onto the desk. Some typed, some handwritten, some that looked like they'd been photocopied so many times the text was barely legible. On top was a single sheet of letterhead from Desert Management Solutions, a company I'd never heard of, despite the fact that they'd supposedly hired me. The letter was brief. Welcome to Desert Wind's RV Park. Your duties as night caretaker are simple. Maintain security, follow all posted procedures, and ensure the continued operation of park facilities. Your shift begins at 11 p.m. and ends at 6 a.m. Under no circumstances should you leave the park grounds during your shift. Payment will be deposited directly into your account each morning. The attached materials contain all necessary information for successful completion of your duties. Strict adherence to all guidelines is mandatory. Thank you for your service. It was signed with an illegible scrawl above the typed name, Amanda Blackwood, Site Supervisor. Beneath the letter was a thick stack of papers held together with a rusty binder clip. The top page was labeled Official Procedures and Guidelines, in the same block letters as the envelope. I flipped through quickly, expecting the usual workplace nonsense about time clocks and uniform policies. The first few pages were indeed mundane. Instructions for checking locks, recording vehicle license plates, basic maintenance tasks, standard security work. But as I continued reading, the tone began to shift. The language became more specific, more urgent. And then I reached a section that made me stop reading entirely and look around the empty office as if someone might be watching me. Special Circumstances and Protocols was written in red ink across the top of page 7. Below it, in carefully typed text, was a numbered list. 1. Between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., all exterior lights except emergency lighting must remain off unless specifically required by circumstances detailed in Section C. 2. If you hear children's voices or laughter after midnight, do not investigate. Continue your normal duties and make no acknowledgement of these sounds. 3. Under no circumstances should flash photography be used anywhere on the premises between 3 a.m. and sunrise. This includes cell phone cameras with flash enabled. 4. Site 23 is permanently out of service. Do not approach this location for any reason. If you observe activity at Site 23, record the time in your log, but do not investigate. 5. The office radio must remain on at all times, tuned to 94.7 FM. If static occurs for more than 30 seconds, immediately tune to 101.3 AM and wait for further instructions. The list continued for 2 full pages, each rule more bizarre than the last. Some were oddly specific. If you encounter an individual asking about the Henderson family, direct them to leave the premises immediately and contact the number listed in Appendix D. Others were vague to the point of being meaningless. Should unusual weather patterns develop, refer to the blue binder in the office safe. I set the papers down and walked to the window, looking out at the empty park. The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was some kind of elaborate prank, or maybe a test to see how gullible I was. But the desperate part of my brain, the part that had been counting loose change for dinner money, reminded me that I needed this job regardless of how weird it seemed. And there was something else, something I didn't want to acknowledge. As I stood there reading those rules, I felt a subtle but unmistakable sense of relief, as if some part of me had been waiting for instructions, for someone to tell me how to survive whatever this place really was. I walked back to the desk and continued reading. The rules became increasingly specific and increasingly disturbing. References to visitors who might appear at various times of night. Instructions for dealing with lost individuals who might claim to be looking for family members who had stayed at the park years ago. Detailed protocols for handling equipment malfunctions that seemed to involve far more than simple maintenance issues. By the time I reached the end of the list, My hand was shaking slightly. Not from fear, exactly, but from a growing certainty that I was in over my head. Yet the alternative, returning to my empty apartment and the eviction notice, seemed somehow worse than whatever these rules were designed to protect me from. The final page was a simple form titled, Acknowledgement of Receipt. It stated that by signing, I confirmed that I had read and understood all procedures, that I would follow them exactly as written, and that I understood the consequences of failure to comply could be severe. There was a line for my signature and the date. I picked up the pen that had been left next to the form, but before I could sign, I heard something that made me freeze. From somewhere outside, carried on air, so still it shouldn't have been able to carry anything, came the unmistakable sound of children laughing. I checked my phone. 12:17 a.m. According to rule number 2, I was supposed to ignore this completely. But the sound was so clear, so joyful and normal, that ignoring it seemed not just difficult but wrong. These could be real children, lost or in trouble. What kind of person follows a bizarre written rule instead of helping kids who might be in danger? The laughter came again, closer this time, and I could make out individual voices. At least 3 children, maybe more. They seemed to be playing some kind of game, their voices mixing and overlapping in the way children's voices do when they're completely absorbed in their own little world. I walked to the window and pressed my face against the glass, trying to see into the darkness beyond the office lights. For a moment, I thought I saw movement near one of the distant RV sites, small figures running between the concrete pads. But the more I stared, the less certain I became. The darkness seemed to shift and move on its own, creating shapes that might have been children or might have been nothing at all. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had started. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, and I realized I had been holding my breath. My reflection stared back at me from the window glass, pale, wide-eyed, looking exactly like someone who was in way over their head. I returned to the desk and signed the acknowledgement form without reading it again. Whatever I got myself into, I was committed now. The pen felt unnaturally heavy in my hand, and my signature looked strange and unfamiliar, as if someone else had written it. As I set the pen down, the office radio crackled to life. I hadn't noticed it before, an old boom box sitting on a shelf behind the desk. The display showed 94.7, exactly as specified in the rules, and soft country music drifted from the speakers. The sound was strangely comforting after the oppressive silence, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders ease. I gathered up all the papers and stuffed them back into the envelope, then walked to the door. My shift had officially begun, and according to the schedule, I was supposed to conduct my first patrol of the grounds at 12:30 a.m. I had exactly 8 minutes to prepare myself for whatever that might involve. Standing in the doorway of the office, looking out at the maze of empty RV sites stretching into the darkness, I wondered for the first time if the previous night caretaker had quit or if something else had happened to him. The job posting had mentioned nothing about replacing anyone, just that the position was immediately available. In the distance, barely audible over the radio, I heard what sounded like a car door slamming. But when I looked toward the sound, I saw only empty desert and the faint outline of mountains against the star-filled sky. Just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe thermal expansion of metal cooling in the desert night. But as I checked the time on my phone and prepared to begin my first patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by anything I could see or identify, but by the darkness itself, as if the empty spaces between the light poles had developed eyes and were studying me with the patient attention of a predator sizing up its prey. The radio continued playing softly behind me, and I found myself grateful for that small connection to the normal world. Whatever happened during the next 5.5 hours, at least I wouldn't be facing it in complete silence. I shouldered my backpack and stepped into the Nevada night, the gravel crunching beneath my feet sounding like breaking bones in the stillness. Somewhere in the distance, so faint I might have imagined it. I heard the echo of children's laughter. The flashlight felt like a lifeline in my hand as I began my first patrol, its LED beam cutting through the darkness like a sword through black silk. According to the schedule, I was supposed to walk a specific route through the park, checking each section systematically and recording any anomalies in a logbook I found tucked under the radio. The logbook was leather-bound and thick, filled with entries from previous caretakers dating back several years. I'd flipped through it briefly and noticed that many entries were just routine notes about weather maintenance, but others were more cryptic. Site 12, unusual electrical activity, followed Protocol C, 7, or 3:45 a.m., visitor inquiry handled per Section 9 guidelines. The first section of my route took me past sites 1 through 15, concrete pads arranged in 2 neat rows along the main road. Most were empty except for utility hookups and weathered picnic tables, but a few of what looked like permanently parked RVs. These weren't the modern, sleek motorhomes you see in camping magazines. They were older models, travel trailers from the 1980s and early 90s, their aluminum siding dulled by years of desert sun and sandstorms. As I approached Site 7, my flashlight beam swept across something that made me stop walking. One of the RVs had its porch light on, a bare bulb hanging from a makeshift fixture jury-rigged to the trailer's awning. But the light wasn't steady. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost organic, like a heartbeat made visible. On, off, in a pattern too regular to be a loose connection, but too irregular to be intentional. I pulled out the rule packet and flipped through it until I found the section on lighting. Rule 14 stated, porch lights on unoccupied units that exhibit irregular behavior should be reported but not investigated. Continue normal patrol patterns and do not approach closer than 20 feet to affected units. 20 feet. I measured the distance with my eyes and realized I was standing exactly at the boundary. Somehow, without consciously thinking about it, I had stopped at precisely the right distance. That bothered me more than the pulsing light itself. The RV looked abandoned, rust stains running down its sides like tears, windows dark, and reflecting my flashlight beam back at me like dead eyes. But as I stood there watching the light pulse, I could have sworn I saw movement behind one of the windows. Not the clear silhouette of a person, but something more subtle, like a shadow shifting within shadows. I forced myself to continue walking, checking off Site 7 in my mental notes as irregular lighting activity observed, no further action taken. But I could feel that pulsing light on my back as I moved away, and I had to resist the urge to turn around and look again. Sites 8 through 15 were unremarkable. Empty concrete pads with nothing but utility hookups and the occasional tumbleweed caught against a picnic table. But as I approached the turn toward the second row of sites, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Not mine. These were coming from somewhere behind me, matching my pace exactly. I've been walking at a steady rhythm, and these steps have been echoing mine so perfectly that it had taken me several seconds to notice them. I stopped walking and listened intently. Silence. I took 3 quick steps forward. Nothing. I began walking again at my normal pace, but this time I counted my steps and listened carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there they were again. Footsteps on gravel, perfectly synchronized with mine, but coming from a different direction entirely. I stopped again, immediately, without warning myself. Silence. But this time the silence felt different. Not empty, but full of held breath and waiting. I turned around slowly, sweeping my flashlight beam across the area I just walked through. Empty concrete pads, dark RVs, nothing moving. But the beam seemed weaker somehow, as if the darkness was actively fighting against it. I pulled out the rule packet again and searched for anything about footsteps or being followed. I found it in Section 8. Audio phenomena, including echoing footsteps, voices, or mechanical sounds may occur during patrol duties. These phenomena should be noted in the logbook, but do not require direct investigation. Continue normal patrol patterns and maintain standard safety protocols. Standard safety protocols. I flipped to the section on safety protocols and found a single line. Trust the rules above all other instincts. The simplicity of it was both comforting and terrifying. Whatever was happening here, someone had experienced it before and had developed procedures for dealing with it. All I had to do was follow the instructions and everything would be fine. The fact that I was being asked to ignore my most basic human instincts, to investigate strange sounds, to help children who might be in trouble, to photograph potential evidence, was just part of the job. I continued my patrol, and the footsteps resumed, but now that I knew to expect them, they seemed less threatening. Just another part of the weird ecosystem of Desert Wind's RV park. By the time I completed the first section and moved on to sites 16 through 30, I was almost getting used to my invisible walking companion. Almost. Site 23 appeared in my flashlight beam like a wound in the orderly grid of the RV park. While the other sites were simple concrete pads with utility hookups, Site 23 was surrounded by orange construction fencing topped with razor wire. Large signs reading "Danger, Do Not Enter" were posted every few feet, and the concrete pad itself was cracked and buckled as if something had pushed up from underneath it. But it was what lay beyond the fencing that really caught my attention. Instead of the empty desert that surrounded the rest of the park, Site 23 backed up against what looked like a sinkhole. A perfectly circular depression in the earth, maybe 20 feet across, dropping down into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam seemed to disappear into it without illuminating anything, as if the hole absorbed light rather than reflecting it. I remembered the rule clearly. Do not approach this location for any reason. But standing at what I estimated to be a safe distance, I couldn't help but stare into that perfectly round opening in the earth. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made me want to get closer, to shine my light down into the depths and see what was really down there. As I stood there fighting the urge to approach the fencing, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From somewhere deep in the hole came the faint sound of metal scraping against stone, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone, or something, was digging. I stepped backward involuntarily, my heel catching on a piece of broken asphalt. As I stumbled and caught myself, my flashlight beam swung wildly, and for just a moment it illuminated something at the edge of the sinkhole that hadn't been there seconds before. A ladder. An aluminum extension ladder, the kind used by roofers and painters, extending down into the darkness. The metal gleamed in my flashlight beam, and I could see that the rungs showed signs of recent use, scratches and were marks that looked fresh. I blinked and redirected my light toward the sinkhole. The ladder was gone. No ladder, no fresh scratches, just the same perfectly round opening dropping into impenetrable darkness. But the scraping sound continued, growing slightly louder and more insistent. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the logbook and wrote. 12:47 a.m. Site 23 visual and audio anomalies observed. No approach attempted per standing orders. My handwriting looked foreign and unsteady, and I had to concentrate to form the letters properly. I forced myself to continue the patrol, leaving Site 23 and its impossible sinkhole behind. But I could feel it pulling at me like a magnet, and I had to consciously resist the urge to turn around and look back. The scraping sound faded as I moved away, but it didn't disappear entirely. It seemed to follow me like a whisper at the edge of my hearing. The remaining sites in the section were mercifully normal, just empty pads and a few more aging RVs. But as I approached the third section of the park, I noticed that the footsteps echoing mine had changed. Instead of matching my pace exactly, they were now slightly off rhythm, creating a syncopated pattern that was somehow more unsettling than the perfect synchronization had been. And there was something else. As I walked past Site 28, I caught a whiff of something that didn't belong in the desert. The smell of breakfast cooking. Bacon, eggs, coffee toast. Rich, warm smells that made my stomach growl and reminded me that I hadn't eaten since lunch. But Site 28 was empty, just another concrete pad with a picnic table and a rusted barbecue grill. I stopped walking and breathed deeply through my nose. The smell was definitely there, not imagination, not wishful thinking, but real aromas of a full breakfast being prepared nearby. But there was no smoke from any of the RVs, no lights in any windows, no sound of cooking or conversation. According to the rules, olfactory phenomena were to be noted, but not investigated. I added another entry to the logbook, 12:52 a.m. Cooking odors detected near Site 28. No visible source identified. But as I wrote, the smell grew stronger, and I found myself imagining sitting down to a hot breakfast with other people, conversation and laughter, and the simple comfort of shared food. It occurred to me then that I hadn't eaten with another person in over 2 weeks, not since losing my last job. The isolation of unemployment had been almost worse than the financial pressure, and the thought of sitting alone in my empty apartment for another day had been part of what made this bizarre job seem appealing. But now, standing in an abandoned RV park in the Nevada desert, following rules that defied common sense, and experiencing phenomena that challenged reality itself, I realized that loneliness might have been the safer option. The breakfast smell faded as I continued walking, replaced by the clean, empty scent of desert air. But the memory of it lingered, and I found myself wondering who had been cooking, and where, and whether they might have invited me to join them if I'd been allowed to investigate. By the time I completed the third section of the patrol, I had logged 7 separate anomalies: the pulsing light, the echoing footsteps, the sounds from the sinkhole, the cooking smells, and 3 other minor incidents involving unexpected sounds and brief glimpses of movement that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Each entry in the logbook was dutifully recorded per the guidelines, but I was beginning to understand that the real purpose of these rules wasn't to help me document what was happening. It was to help me survive it. The radio in the office was still playing when I completed my patrol and returned to file my report. Soft country music drifted through the open door, a reassuring constant in an increasingly surreal night. But as I sat down at the desk to complete the paperwork, the music stopped mid-song and was replaced by static. I looked at the clock on my phone. 1:23 a.m. According to the rules, static lasting more than 30 seconds required switching to 101.3 a.m. and waiting for instructions. I watched the second hand on the office clock, counting silently as the white noise filled the room. 31 seconds. 32. I reached for the radio and changed the frequency to 101.3. The static disappeared immediately, replaced by a clear, professional voice that sounded like it was reading from a script. Desert Wind's night caretaker, this is Control. Please confirm your status and location. I stared at the radio, my mouth suddenly dry. The voice was addressing me directly, which meant someone was monitoring my activities in real time. But from where? And how did they know exactly when I would tune in? Desert Wind's night caretaker, the voice repeated. Please respond with your status and current location. I picked up the microphone attached to the radio, surprised that my hands weren't shaking. This is David Torres at Desert Wind's RV Park. I'm in the main office completing my first patrol report. Status is normal, I guess. Thank you, David. Please confirm that all anomalies observed during your patrol have been properly logged according to Section 12 guidelines. I flipped through the rule packet until I found Section 12. It detailed the proper format for anomaly reports, including specific codes for different types of phenomena. I hadn't used the codes. I'd just written descriptions, but somehow Control already knew about the anomalies I'd observed. I've logged everything, I said into the microphone. but I didn't use the numerical codes. Should I redo the entries? Negative. Your initial entries are acceptable for your first night. Future reports should follow standard coding procedures. Please confirm that you have not violated any approach or investigation protocols. The question felt loaded with meaning. I thought about how close I got to Site 23, about my urge to investigate the pulsing light and the breakfast smells. Had I crossed any lines without realizing it? I followed all the rules, I said. I didn't investigate anything directly. Excellent. Continue normal patrol procedures. Next scheduled contact will be at 0300 hours. Control out. The radio fell silent, then slowly faded back to country music. I sat there staring at the device, trying to process what had just happened. Someone was watching me, monitoring my activities, and had the ability to contact me through the radio whenever they chose. The isolation I'd felt since arriving at the park was apparently an illusion. I was being observed and evaluated every moment of my shift. But by whom and from where? The voice had been clear and professional, but it had also been completely anonymous. Control could be located in an office building in Las Vegas or in a bunker underneath the desert. For all I knew, Control could be in one of the RVs I'd walked past during my patrol. I completed my report using the numerical codes from Section 12, translating my written descriptions into a series of letters and numbers that reduced the night's strangeness to bureaucratic shorthand. Anomaly Type C, 4 for unexplained lighting. Anomaly Type A, 7 for auditory echoing phenomena. Anomaly Type D, 2 for olfactory manifestations without visible source. The codes made everything seem more manageable somehow, as if giving the strangeness official designations somehow tamed it. But as I filed the report in the designated folder, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was documenting something much more significant than workplace oddities. I was creating a record of my first contact with something that defied rational explanation. And somewhere, someone called Control was reading every word. The second patrol was scheduled for 2:15 a.m., and as I prepared to venture back into the darkness, I noticed that the radio had gone silent again. Not static this time, just complete absence of sound, as if someone had turned off the transmitter. I checked the frequency display. Still 94.7, still properly tuned, but producing nothing except the soft electronic hum of powered speakers with no signal. According to the rules, radio silence outside of scheduled static intervals was classified as an anomaly type B, 3, and required immediate consultation with the emergency procedures checklist. I found the checklist tucked behind the logbook, a laminated card covered in small print and decision trees that looked more like a troubleshooting guide for nuclear reactor technicians and instructions for a night security guard. The flowchart led me through a series of yes/no questions. Is the silence total or partial? Total. Are you currently between scheduled contact times? Yes. Have you observed any type A, C, or D anomalies in the past hour? Yes, several. Proceed to Emergency Protocol 7B. Emergency Protocol 7B was surprisingly simple. Continue normal duties while maintaining heightened awareness. Document all phenomena with increased detail. Avoid unnecessary risks and trust established procedures above personal judgment. The last line was underlined in red ink, as if someone had learned the hard way that personal judgment could be dangerous in this place. I clipped the emergency procedures card in my shirt pocket and headed out for the second patrol, this time carrying a digital camera I'd found in the desk drawer. The camera was an older model, maybe 10 years old, but had been modified with tape over the flash and a warning label reading "No flash after 3 a.m. Violation subject to immediate termination." The silence outside was even more oppressive without the background comfort of the radio. My footsteps seemed to echo off invisible surfaces, creating a strange acoustic effect that made the empty park feel like the interior of a vast cathedral. But as I began walking the prescribed route, I realized that my phantom companion was still there. The echoing footsteps that had followed me during the first patrol were back, this time with what sounded like additional walkers. Instead of just one set of synchronized steps, I could now distinguish at least 3 distinct patterns. One that matched my pace exactly, one that lagged slightly behind, and a third that seemed to anticipate my movements, stepping just a fraction of a second before I did. The effect was like being accompanied by an invisible marching band that couldn't quite agree on the tempo. I stopped abruptly and pulled out the camera, remembering the rule about documenting phenomena with increased detail. The footsteps stopped too, but not all at once. The synchronized steps cut off immediately. The lagging steps took another second or two to catch up and stop, and the anticipatory steps continued for 3 more beats before falling silent. In that brief moment between the last phantom footstep and complete silence, I heard something else, breathing. Slow, measured breathing coming from at least 2 different directions. Not human breathing, exactly, but something similar, like the sound a large animal might make while sleeping, but deliberate and aware. I raised the camera and took several photos of the empty space around me, being careful to keep the flash disabled. The digital display showed nothing but darkness and the weak pools of light cast by the distant lampposts. But when I reviewed the photos immediately after taking them, I noticed something odd about the shadows. In each photo, there were shadow patterns that didn't correspond to any visible objects. Long, thin shadows stretching across the concrete pads, cast by things that weren't there. In one photo, I could clearly see the shadow of what looked like a person standing next to Site 19, but when I looked up from the camera, Site 19 was empty. I took several more photos in rapid succession, then reviewed them on the camera's screen. In the first photo, the shadow person was at Site 19. In the second, it had moved closer to Site 17. In the third, it was at Site 15. The shadow was walking toward me, photo by photo, even though I could see nothing with my naked eyes. My hands were shaking as I lowered the camera and looked around the empty park. Everything looked normal. Concrete pads, picnic tables, aging RVs with dark windows. But according to my camera, I was surrounded by invisible figures casting very visible shadows. I forced myself to continue walking, following the prescribed patrol route while resisting the urge to stop and take photos every few feet. But I could feel them around me now, the presence of things I couldn't see but that were undeniably there. The breathing sounds continued, sometimes close enough that I could feel warm air on the back of my neck, sometimes distant and echoing off the empty buildings. When I reached Site 23 and its forbidden sinkhole, I noticed that the scraping sounds had stopped. The construction fencing was still there. The warning signs were still posted, but the perfectly round hole in the earth was silent. I kept my distance as instructed, but I couldn't help noticing that the hole looked different somehow. Smaller, maybe, or not as deep. It was hard to tell in the darkness, but something had definitely changed. I raised the camera and took a photo of Site 23, being careful to stay well outside the 20-foot boundary. When I reviewed the image, what I saw made me stumble backward and nearly drop the camera. The sinkhole wasn't empty. In the photo, clearly visible in the camera's infrared flash, were dozens of pale faces looking up at me from the depths. Men, women, children, all crowded together at the bottom of the hole, all staring directly at the camera with expressions of desperate hunger. Their mouths were open as if they were calling out, but I could hear nothing from the direction of the sinkhole. I looked up from the camera display and stared at the hole with my naked eyes. Still empty, still silent. Just a circular opening in the earth dropping down into darkness. But the camera saw something else entirely, something that was apparently very real and very aware of my presence. I backed away from Site 23, adding another entry to my mental catalog of things to report. Photographic anomalies at restricted site, Infrared imaging reveals phenomena not visible to direct observation. But as I moved on to complete the patrol, I could feel those hungry eyes following me, and I had to resist the urge to turn around and take another photo. The breathing sounds grew stronger as I approached the final section of the patrol route. What had started as barely audible whispers of air had become clearly audible respiration, and I was now certain that there were at least 4 distinct patterns, different rhythms, different depths, as if I were being accompanied by a variety of invisible beings with different lung capacities and breathing needs. But it was when I reached Site 31 that things took a turn from strange to genuinely frightening. Site 31 housed one of the permanent RVs, a 1980s air travel trailer that looked like it had been parked there for decades. Unlike the other units I'd observed, this one showed signs of recent habitation. Curtains in the windows, a welcome mat by the door, and a small garden of desert plants arranged in decorative pots around the entrance. But what caught my attention was the soft glow coming from behind the curtains. Not the harsh light of electric bulbs, but the warm, flickering illumination of candles or oil lamps. As I approached, maintaining the required 15-foot distance specified for occupied units, I could hear the faint sound of music playing inside. Old-fashioned big band music, the kind my grandfather used to listen to, drifting through the thin walls of the trailer. I consulted the rule packet and found the guidelines for occupied units. Residents of permanent installations are not subject to night patrol procedures. Do not disturb occupants unless specifically requested to do so. Record presence and any unusual activity, but maintain respectful distance and avoid unnecessary interaction. The music wasn't unusual, exactly, but something about it felt wrong. The tempo was slightly off, as if the record player was running at the wrong speed, and there were gaps in the melody where instruments seemed to drop out mid-phrase, only to rejoin several beats later. It was like listening to a jazz ensemble, where half the musicians were playing from memory, while the other half read from a score with missing pages. I raised the camera and took a photo of Site 31, being careful to frame the shot so that it captured the trailer without invading the privacy of whoever might be inside. When I reviewed the image, my breath caught in my throat. The trailer in the photo was a ruin. Windows broken, door hanging off its hinges, walls stained with decades of weather damage and neglect. No curtains, no welcome mat, no decorative plants. Just a derelict shell that looked like it had been abandoned since the 1990s. But I could still see the warm light glowing inside, still hear the distorted big band music playing at the wrong speed. I looked up from the camera and stared at the trailer with my naked eyes. Neat curtains, welcome mat, well-maintained siding. The contradiction was so stark that I actually blinked several times, as if I could somehow reset my vision and make sense of what I was seeing. The music stopped abruptly, mid-song, leaving only the oppressive silence of the desert night. For a moment, I thought whoever was inside had noticed me and turned off their radio. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of footsteps inside the trailer, moving toward the door. According to the rules, I was supposed to maintain my distance and avoid interaction unless specifically requested. But as the footsteps grew closer to the door, every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. There was something wrong with those footsteps, something that didn't match the cozy domestic scene I was observing with my eyes. The footsteps were too heavy, for one thing. They sounded like someone wearing heavy boots was walking across the trailer's floor, each step creating a hollow thudding sound that seemed to shake the entire structure. But more than that, there were too many of them. I could distinguish at least 3 distinct sets of footsteps, all moving toward the door, but the trailer was barely large enough for one person to live comfortably. The door handle began to turn. I backed away quickly, my own footsteps suddenly seeming impossibly loud on the gravel path. Behind me, the invisible breathing sounds had intensified, as if whatever was following me had become agitated by the activity at Site 31. I could feel them pressing closer, their presence like a weight on my shoulders, urging me to move faster. The trailer door opened just as I reached what I estimated to be a safe distance. In a warm glow spilling from the interior, I could see a figure silhouetted in the doorway. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like formal clothing from decades past. The figure raised its hand in what might have been a greeting or might have been a warning, and I caught a glimpse of a face that seemed to shift and blur even as I looked at it, as if it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to look like. I took a photo instinctively, forgetting for a moment about the rule against disturbing residents. The camera flash was disabled, but the soft click of the shutter seemed to echo across the empty park like a gunshot. The figure in the doorway went perfectly still. Then it stepped out of the trailer and began walking toward me. I didn't wait to see what the camera had captured. I turned and walked quickly toward the next section of the patrol route, fighting the urge to break into a run. Behind me, I could hear the figure's footsteps on gravel, steady and purposeful, maintaining a constant distance that suggested it was following me rather than trying to catch up. The invisible breathing sounds around me had become agitated, almost panicked, as if whatever was accompanying me was trying to warn me about the newcomer. The phantom footsteps that had been echoing mine all night were now chaotic and overlapping, creating a cacophony of non-existent steps that made it impossible to determine which sounds were real and which were just echoes of echoes. I completed the patrol route as quickly as possible while still maintaining the appearance of following proper procedures. Every few minutes, I would glance back to check on the figure from Site 31, and each time I did, it was still there, maintaining the same distance, walking with the same steady rhythm, never getting closer but never falling behind. By the time I reached the office, I was sweating despite the desert cold. My hands were shaking as I filled out the patrol report, trying to translate the night's experiences into the clinical language required by the forms. But how do you describe the feeling of being followed by something that might not be entirely human? How do you categorize the discovery that your camera sees a different world than your eyes do? I settled for the available codes. Anomaly type C, 7 for residential lighting irregularities. Anomaly type A, 9 for unexplained audio phenomena. And anomaly type F, 2 for photographic inconsistencies with visual observation. The codes made it all seem routine, just another night at Desert Winds RV Park. But as I wrote them down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was documenting something much more significant than workplace anomalies. The radio was still silent when I completed my report. According to the schedule, Control wasn't due to contact me until 3 a.m., but I found myself wishing they would call early. The isolation of the office was starting to feel less like safety and more like a trap, especially knowing that the figure from Site 31 was still out there somewhere in the darkness. I walked to the window and peered out at the park. Everything looked normal. Empty sites, aging RVs, pools of light from the lampposts. But I knew now that normal was just an illusion, a surface layer hiding something much stranger and more complex. The real Desert Winds RV Park existed in the shadows cast by invisible figures, in the sounds that echoed from empty spaces, in the images captured by infrared cameras that revealed truths the human I couldn't process. As I stood there watching the empty darkness, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with dread. Near Site 31, barely visible at the edge of the lamplight, I could see a tall, thin figure standing perfectly still, watching the office, watching me. I grabbed the camera and took a photo through the window, then immediately checked the display. The figure was still there in the photo, but now I could see its face clearly. It was definitely human, or had been once, but the features were wrong somehow. Too sharp, too angular, as if someone had tried to recreate a human face from memory and had gotten most of the details right, but missed some crucial element that separated the living from something else. And it was smiling. a wide, unnaturally white smile that showed too many teeth. I lowered the camera and looked out the window with my naked eyes. The figure was gone. Just empty darkness and the distant glow of lampposts. But I could feel it out there, waiting and watching, and I knew that when I left the office for my next patrol, it would be waiting for me. The digital clock on my phone showed 2:47 a.m., 13 minutes until my scheduled radio contact with Control. 13 minutes to prepare for whatever instructions they might give me, and to decide whether I was brave enough or desperate enough to continue following rules that seemed designed to protect me from something that defied rational explanation. Outside in the darkness, something that looked almost human was learning to smile, and I was beginning to understand that the most dangerous part of my job might not be the strange phenomena I was supposed to ignore. It might be the things that were starting to pay attention to me. The radio crackled to life at exactly 3 a.m., startling me from my anxious vigil at the office window. I'd been watching the empty darkness for the past 13 minutes, jumping at every shadow and phantom movement, but the figure from Site 31 had not reappeared, at least not visibly. Desert Wind's night caretaker, this is Control. Please respond with your current status. I grabbed the microphone, grateful to hear another human voice, even if it belonged to the anonymous entity monitoring my every move. This is David Torres. I'm in the main office, completed second patrol at 0247 hours. Status is, I paused, unsure how to categorize what I'd experienced. Status is operational with multiple anomalies reported. Copy that, David. We show increased activity levels across all monitoring sectors. Please confirm that you have maintained proper distances and protocols during all anomaly encounters. The question sent a chill down my spine. If Control was monitoring multiple sectors, that meant they had surveillance equipment throughout the park. Cameras, audio pickups, maybe other sensors I hadn't noticed. I thought about the figure from Site 31, about how it had seemed to know exactly when I'd taken its photograph. I followed all written protocols, I said carefully. Maintained specified distances, used proper documentation procedures, avoided direct investigation of restricted areas. Excellent. Please note that activity levels typically increase significantly between 0300 and 0500 hours. Exercise additional caution during remaining patrol duties. Are you prepared to receive special instructions for the remainder of your shift? Special instructions. I flipped through the rule packet, looking for any mention of additional procedures that might be implemented during periods of high activity. I found a section titled Elevated Response Protocols that had been marked with a red stamp reading, Authorized Personnel Only. I'm ready for instructions, I said, though every fiber of my being was screaming that I wasn't ready for anything this place might throw at me. Beginning at 0315 hours, you will implement Protocol Delta 7. Detailed instructions are in the sealed envelope marked Emergency Procedures in the bottom desk drawer. Do not open the envelope until 0315 hours. Do not discuss the contents of these instructions with anyone. Do you copy? I pulled out the bottom desk drawer and found the envelope immediately. Thick, manila paper sealed with red wax and marked with warnings in multiple languages. The English text read, Emergency Procedures, Protocol Delta 7. Authorized personnel only. Violation subject to immediate termination and prosecution. I copy, I said. Special instructions envelope located. Implement Protocol Delta 7 at 0315 hours. Correct. Maintain radio contact throughout implementation. Report any deviations from protocol immediately. Control out. The radio fell silent, leaving me alone with the sealed envelope and a growing sense of dread. I checked the time on my phone. 3:04 a.m. 11 minutes to wait. 11 minutes to wonder what kind of special procedures required emergency protocols and legal threats. I walked to the window, and looked out at the park again. Everything still appeared normal, but I was beginning to understand that appearance and reality were two very different things at Desert Winds. The figure from Site 31 might be invisible to my naked eyes, but that didn't mean it wasn't out there. The breathing sounds that had followed me during my patrols might not register on normal audio equipment, but they were undeniably real. And somewhere in this maze of empty RV sites and aging trailers, things were stirring that the day shift caretaker, if there even was a day shift caretaker, would never encounter. At exactly 3:15 a.m., I broke the wax seal on the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in dense, small print text. The heading read, Protocol Delta 7, Active Containment Procedures for Elevated Threat Conditions. The instructions were unlike anything I'd read in the regular rule packet. Instead of passive observation and documentation, Protocol Delta 7 required direct action. I was to conduct an immediate inspection of all occupied RV units, checking for signs of unauthorized access or inhabitant displacement. I was to document the exact position of all movable objects at Sites 5, 12, 18, and 31, photographing any items that appear to have been moved since the previous night. Most disturbing of all, I was required to approach Site 23 and verify that containment barriers remain intact and functional. The 20-foot safety perimeter was reduced to 5 feet during Delta 7 implementation. My hands were shaking as I read through the instructions a second time, looking for some escape clause or alternative procedure. But the language was clear and unambiguous. Protocol Delta 7 was mandatory during elevated threat conditions, and failure to implement it properly was grounds for immediate termination and legal action. I gathered my equipment, flashlight, camera, logbook, and a new addition mentioned in the Delta 7 instructions, a handheld device that looked like a cross between a metal detector and a radiation counter. According to the instructions, this was a paranormal activity detector that would help me identify areas of elevated spectral density. The detector had been sitting in a locked box in the office closet, along with a set of keys I was now authorized to use. As soon as I turned it on, the device began clicking rapidly, its needle jumping into the red zone marked Extreme Caution Advised. I was still in the office, and the detector was already maxed out. I turned it off and clipped it to my belt, then headed out into the night for what would definitely be my strangest patrol yet. The invisible breathing sounds were waiting for me as soon as I stepped outside, but they seemed different now, more agitated, more urgent, as if whatever was producing them was trying to warn me about something. My first stop was Site 5, which housed a small travel trailer that I noted during my previous patrols as appearing abandoned. But as I approached with the paranormal detector active, the device's clicking increased to a machine gun staccato that hurt my ears. According to the readout, I was walking into a field of paranormal activity, so intense it was off the scale. The trailer itself looked exactly as it had during my earlier patrols. Dark windows, weathered siding, no signs of recent use. But when I took a photograph for documentation purposes, the image revealed something that made me stumble backward in shock. The trailer was full of people, dozens of faces pressed against the windows, all staring out at me with expressions of desperate hunger. Men, women, children, elderly people, all crowded together inside a space that should have been able to hold maybe 4 people comfortably. Their eyes reflected the camera's infrared flash like those of nocturnal animals, and their mouths were open as if they were screaming, but I could hear nothing from the direction of the trailer. I looked up from the camera display and stared at the trailer with my naked eyes. Still dark, still empty, still silent. But the paranormal detector was clicking so rapidly, it sounded like static, and I could swear I felt the weight of dozens of stairs pressing against me from the darkness behind those windows. According to the Delta 7 protocol, I was supposed to document the exact position of any movable objects around the trailer. But as I walked around the perimeter, taking photographs and noting the placement of chairs, grills, and decorative items, I realized that everything had been moved since my first patrol. Not dramatically, just inches here and there, but enough to suggest that someone or something had been rearranging the campsite with subtle, deliberate precision. A folding chair that had been facing east was now turned south. A small table had been moved 3 feet closer to the trailer's door. Most unnervingly, someone had arranged the decorative rocks around the site's fire pit into a perfect spiral pattern that definitely hadn't been there before. I photographed everything, noting the changes in my logbook and trying to ignore the way the paranormal detector's clicking seemed to intensify whenever I got close to the spiral rock formation. But as I prepared to move on to the next site, I noticed something that made me forget all about proper documentation procedures. One of the faces in the trailer window was watching me, not just staring in my general direction like the others, but actively tracking my movements. As I moved from one side of the site to the other, this particular face, a middle-aged woman with hollow cheeks and desperate eyes, turned to follow me. When I stopped, she stopped. When I raised my camera, she pressed closer to the window. I took a photograph of the window where I could see her face most clearly. In the resulting image, she was holding up a sign made from what looked like torn cardboard. Written in crude block letters were 2 words, "Help US." I lowered the camera and stared at the dark window with my naked eyes. Nothing, just my own reflection staring back from the black glass. But I could feel her watching me, could sense the desperate plea radiating from that impossible crowd of people who existed only in infrared photographs and paranormal detector readings. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to break protocol, to approach the trailer and try to help whoever was trapped inside. But the Delta 7 instructions were clear: document and report only. No direct intervention under any circumstances. Whatever was happening at Site 5 was beyond my authority to address. I forced myself to complete the documentation and move on to Site 12, but I could feel those desperate eyes following me as I walked away. The paranormal detector gradually decreased, its clicking as I put distance between myself and the trailer, but it never fell completely silent. Site 12 was even worse. The RV at this location was a massive motorhome that looked like it had been expensive when new, but now showed signs of decades of wear. Unlike the trailer at Site 5, this one showed clear signs of recent occupation. Lights on inside, the sound of a television playing, even a faint aroma of dinner cooking. But when I activated the paranormal detector, it immediately redlined again, and I could hear new sounds coming from inside the motorhome that didn't match the domestic normalcy I was observing. Underneath the television noise and cooking sounds, there was something else, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like someone pounding on the walls from the inside, and a low moaning that rose and fell like a siren. I took photographs of the motorhome's exterior, documenting the position of movable objects as required by the protocol. Like Site 5, everything had been subtly rearranged since my last patrol. Lawn chairs moved, decorative items repositioned, awning adjusted. But here the changes seemed less random and more purposeful, as if someone was trying to send a message through the careful placement of objects. The lawn chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing the desert, as if a group of people had been sitting there watching something in the distance. A small barbecue grill had been moved to the exact center of the concrete pad and positioned so that its opening pointed directly at Site 23 and its forbidden sinkhole. Most disturbing of all, someone had used the decorative gravel around the site to create an arrow pointing toward the office where I was supposed to be taking shelter. As I photographed the arrow, the sound from inside the motorhome grew louder and more agitated. The rhythmic thumping became more frantic, and the moaning was joined by what sounded like voices calling out in a language I didn't recognize. But underneath it all, almost inaudible, I could hear someone speaking in English. "Please," the voice was saying over and over again. "Please, somebody help us. We've been here so long. Please don't leave us here." The voice was coming from inside the motorhome, but when I looked at the windows, I could see the normal glow of electric lights and the flickering of a television screen. No signs of distress, no indication that anyone inside was in trouble. Just the peaceful domestic scene of someone watching TV while cooking dinner. I raised my camera and took a photograph of the motorhome's main window. The image that appeared on the display made me drop the camera entirely. Instead of a cozy RV interior, the photograph showed what looked like a prison cell. Dozens of people were crammed into the space, all pressing against the windows and trying to get my attention. Some were holding up signs with messages I couldn't quite read. Others were pointing desperately toward something outside the frame. And all of them had the same hollow, desperate expression I'd seen in the faces at Site 5. But in the center of the crowd, closest to the window, was a man who looked familiar. It took me a moment to place him, but then I realized where I'd seen his face before in one of the faded Polaroid photographs pinned to the corkboard in the office. He was wearing the same clothes, had the same smile, but now his expression was one of absolute terror. He was holding a sign too, but his message was different from the others. Instead of "Help US," his cardboard placard read, "Don't trust control." I picked up the camera with shaking hands and took another photograph. The man was pointing frantically towards Site 23, his mouth open as if he was shouting something I couldn't hear. The other faces in the crowd had turned to look in the same direction, and I could see genuine fear in their expressions. Whatever was in that sinkhole, these people, or whatever they had become, were terrified of it. The radio crackled to life, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the camera again. "Desert Wind's night caretaker. This is Control. Report your current status and location." I grabbed a radio microphone, my mind racing. According to the man in the photograph, I shouldn't trust Control. But Control was the only contact I had with the outside world, the only source of instructions that had kept me safe so far. "This is David Torres," I said carefully, "currently conducting Delta 7 inspection at Site 12. Documentation proceeding according to protocol." "Copy that, David. Sensors indicate elevated paranormal activity in your immediate vicinity. Exercise extreme caution and do not deviate from established procedures. Report any unusual discoveries immediately." The fact that Control had sensors monitoring paranormal activity shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. It meant they knew exactly what I was encountering, exactly what was happening at each site I visited. They were watching me document the impossible, and they were treating it as routine. "Roger that, Control. Activity levels are definitely elevated. Continuing with inspection procedures. Acknowledged. Be advised that you are approaching the most critical phase of Delta 7 implementation. Next scheduled contact in 30 minutes. Control out." I clipped the radio back to my belt and stared at the motorhome window. With my naked eyes, I could still see the warm glow of electric lights and the peaceful flicker of a television. But I knew that my camera would show me something entirely different, something that challenged everything I thought I understood about reality. The paranormal detector was still clicking rapidly, and the sound from inside the motorhome had grown even more frantic. But underneath the chaos, I could still hear that one voice calling out in English, "Please don't leave us here. Please, somebody help us." I completed the documentation at Site 12 and moved on to Sites 18 and 31, finding similar patterns of subtle rearrangement and impossible photographic revelations at each location. By the time I had finished the required inspections, my logbook was full of observations that read like the field notes of a paranormal investigator, and my camera's memory card was filled with images that seemed to document some kind of supernatural prison. But it was the final requirement of Protocol Delta 7 that truly tested my commitment to following the rules. Verification that the containment barriers at Site 23 remained intact and functional. I approached the forbidden sinkhole with the paranormal detector clicking like an angry insect. its needle pinned at the extreme danger end of the scale. The orange construction fencing looked the same as it had during my previous patrols, and the warning signs were still in place. But as I got closer, now authorized to approach within 5 feet instead of the usual 20, I could see details that had been hidden by distance. The fencing wasn't just construction barriers. Woven into the orange plastic were symbols that looked like they belonged in an occult textbook, and hanging from the posts were objects that definitely didn't come from any hardware store. Bones, crystals, what looked like preserved animal parts, and dozens of small mirrors that reflected my flashlight beam in dizzying patterns. The paranormal detector was clicking so rapidly it sounded like white noise, and I could feel something emanating from the sinkhole itself, a kind of psychic pressure that made my teeth ache and filled my mouth with a metallic taste of fear. I took photographs of the barrier system, documenting each symbol and object as required by the protocol. But when I reviewed the images on the camera's display, I saw something that made me understand why Site 23 was forbidden and why the barriers were so elaborate. The sinkhole wasn't empty. It was full of the same desperate faces I'd seen at the other sites, but these were different somehow. Older, more deteriorated, as if they'd been trapped there much longer. And in the center of the crowd, barely visible at the bottom of the pit, was something that definitely wasn't human. It was large, much larger than a person, and it seemed to be made of shadow and hunger, given physical form. The desperate faces around it weren't trying to escape. They were pressed against the walls of the sinkhole, trying to get away from it, climbing over each other in their panic to put distance between themselves and the thing that shared their prison. But the most terrifying thing about the photograph wasn't what I could see in the sinkhole. It was what I could see at ground level, standing right next to me in the image. The figure from Site 31 was back, closer than ever before, and it wasn't alone. In the infrared photograph, I was surrounded by tall, thin figures with 2 sharp features and 2 wide smiles. At least a dozen of them, all standing within arm's reach, all staring at me with predatory intensity. I looked up from a camera display and spun around, sweeping my flashlight beam across the area around Site 23. Nothing, just empty desert and the distant glow of lampposts. But the paranormal detector was screaming now, its needle dancing wildly across the scale, and I could feel their presence like ice water in my veins. They were learning. The things that inhabited Desert Winds RV Park were adapting to my presence, figuring out how to get closer without triggering my natural senses. And now, armed with the special equipment that let me see what was really happening, I had documented proof that I was never alone during my patrols. I was being hunted. The radio crackled to life just as I finished photographing the containment barriers. Desert Winds Night Caretaker. This is Control. Report completion status of Protocol Delta 7. I stare at the radio, thinking about the man in the motorhome holding his sign, "Don't trust Control." But what choice did I have? Control was my only connection to the outside world, my only source of instructions that might keep me alive until sunrise. Protocol Delta 7 completed. I reported. All sites documented. Containment barriers verified intact. Multiple anomalies recorded per standard procedures. Excellent work, David. You have successfully completed your first emergency protocol implementation. Return to base and prepare final reports. Normal patrol schedule resumes at 0500 hours. I looked at my phone. 4:23 a.m. 1 hour and 37 minutes until sunrise. One more patrol to complete before I could escape whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But as I walked back toward the office, surrounded by invisible figures that only existed in infrared photographs and paranormal detector readings, I realized that escape might not be an option. The desperate faces I'd seen at every site weren't tourists who had checked out and gone home. They were people like me. People who had taken jobs at Desert Winds RV Park and had never left. And somewhere in the darkness behind me, Something that wore a human shape but smiled with too many teeth was learning how to hunt more effectively. The office felt like a sanctuary when I finally returned from the Delta 7 inspection, but I knew it was an illusion. The walls and locked door that had seemed protective during my first hours at Desert Winds now felt more like the bars of a cage. Whatever was hunting me outside could apparently become invisible at will, could manipulate physical objects, and had been studying my behavior patterns all night. A few inches of wood and glass weren't going to stop anything that could do all that. I spread the Delta 7 photographs across the desk, arranging them in chronological order, trying to make sense of what I documented. Each image told the same basic story. Spaces that appeared empty to the naked were actually crowded with trapped people, and I was being stalked by entities that looked almost human, but definitely weren't. The paranormal detector sat next to the photographs, still clicking softly even inside the office. According to its readings, I was surrounded by moderate levels of supernatural activity, even here in what was supposed to be the safe zone. The needle hovered in the yellow caution range, occasionally jumping toward red whenever I moved too close to the windows. But it was the final photograph I'd taken at Site 23 that kept drawing my attention. The image of myself surrounded by tall, thin figures with predatory smiles was disturbing enough. But there was something else in the background that I'd missed during my initial review. Behind the crowd of hungry faces at the bottom of the sinkhole, barely visible in the infrared flash, was what looked like a tunnel opening. The thing made of shadow and hunger wasn't trapped in the sinkhole. It was guarding an entrance to something much larger. I pulled out a magnifying glass from the desk drawer and examined the photograph more closely. The tunnel opening was definitely artificial, with what looked like concrete or stone walls extending back into darkness. And carved into the wall, just inside the entrance, barely readable in the low-resolution image, were symbols that matched the ones woven into the containment barriers. Desert Winds RV Park wasn't built on top of a natural sinkhole. It was built on top of something that had been deliberately sealed, and the entire park was apparently designed to keep whatever was down there from getting out. The radio crackled softly, startling me from my examination of the photographs. Desert Winds Night Caretaker, this is Control. Please report your current activities. I looked at the clock, 4:47 a.m., 13 minutes before my final patrol was scheduled to begin. Control wasn't due to contact me for another hour, which meant either something had changed or they were monitoring my activities more closely than usual. This is David Torres, currently in the office completing Delta 7 documentation, preparing for final patrol at 0500 hours. Copy that, David. Be advised that dawn conditions can present unique challenges at your location. Exercise additional caution during transition period between night and day operations. Dawn conditions. I flipped through the rule packet looking for any mention of special procedures related to sunrise, but found nothing. Apparently, this was information that hadn't been included in the standard briefing materials. Roger that, Control. Can you provide specific guidance regarding dawn transition protocols? There's a longer pause than usual before Control responded, and when the voice came back, it sounded different somehow. Still professional, still anonymous, but with an undertone of something that might have been concern. Dawn transition protocols are classified above your clearance level, David. Continue following standard procedures and maintain radio contact throughout final patrol. If you encounter any phenomena that deviates significantly from established patterns, report immediately and await instructions. The fact that there were protocols I wasn't clear to know about was somehow more unsettling than all the supernatural phenomena I'd encountered during the night. It suggested that whatever was happening at Desert Winds was part of a larger operation, something with multiple security levels and classified information. Understood, Control. Maintaining standard procedures. Beginning final patrol in 12 minutes. Acknowledged. Good luck, David. The radio fell silent, but the sign-off bothered me. In all our previous communications, control had been strictly professional. No personal comments, no expressions of concern or encouragement. The fact that they'd wish me luck suggested that the final patrol might be more dangerous than anything I'd experienced so far. I gathered my equipment and headed outside, noting immediately that something had changed in the atmosphere of the park. The oppressive silence was still there, but it felt different now, expectant rather than empty, as if the entire desert was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. The invisible breathing sounds that had accompanied my earlier patrols were gone entirely, replaced by a subtle vibration that I could feel more than hear. The ground itself seemed to be humming with some kind of energy, and the paranormal detector's clicking had increased to a steady rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. As I began walking toward the first section of the patrol route, I noticed that the shadows cast by the lamppost had changed. Instead of the normal patterns created by static lighting, the shadows were moving independently, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the laws of physics. When I stopped to observe them more closely, they stopped too. When I resumed walking, they resumed their impossible dance. I raised my camera and took a photograph of one of the dancing shadows. The resulting image showed exactly what I'd expected and dreaded. The shadow was being cast by one of the tall, thin figures that had been following me all night. But this time, instead of remaining invisible to my naked eyes, I could see a faint outline of the creature creating the shadow. It was becoming more solid, more present in the physical world. As I continued the patrol, taking photographs and noting the increasing visibility of my supernatural stalkers, I began to understand what control had meant about dawn transition presenting unique challenges. Whatever process kept these entities partially invisible was breaking down as sunrise approached. They were becoming more solid, more present, and according to the increasingly frantic clicking of the paranormal detector, much more dangerous. By the time I reached Site 23 for my final check of the containment barriers, the tall figures were visible as faint outlines, even without the camera. Translucent humanoid shapes that flickered in and out of existence, but definitely there. And they were no longer maintaining their careful distance. They were pressing closer, forming a loose circle around me as I walked. The sinkhole looked different in the pre-dawn light. The perfectly round opening still dropped into darkness, but now I could see that the walls weren't natural stone. They were lined with the same concrete that formed the RV pads, and I could make out what looked like rebar reinforcements extending down into the depths. This wasn't a natural sinkhole that had been discovered during construction. It was something that had been built deliberately, engineered to contain whatever lay at the bottom. The containment barriers were still in place, but as I approached for my final inspection, I noticed that some of the ritual objects hanging from the fence posts had changed position. The mirrors that had reflected my flashlight beam in dizzying patterns were now all turned toward the sinkhole, as if they were focusing some kind of energy downward. The bones and crystals seemed to pulse with a faint light that had nothing to do with my flashlight, and the occult symbols woven into the fencing were glowing with a phosphorescent radiance that hurt to look at directly. I took photographs of the altar barrier system, and each image revealed more details than my naked eyes could process. The mirrors weren't just reflecting light. They were creating geometric patterns that formed complex mathematical equations in the air above the sinkhole. The bones weren't random animal parts. They were arranged in specific configurations that matched symbols from ancient binding rituals. And the crystals weren't decorative. They were channeling some kind of energy from deep underground up into the barrier system. But it was what I saw in the sinkhole itself that made me understand the true purpose of Desert Wind's RV park. In the infrared photograph, the desperate faces I'd seen before were gone. The bottom of the pit was empty except for the shadow creature. But the creature had changed. It was larger now, more solid, and it was climbing, not up the walls of the sinkhole, but up what looked like a spiral staircase that had been carved into the concrete lining. The tunnel opening I'd glimpsed earlier wasn't at the bottom of the pit. It was the entrance to a vertical shaft that extended much deeper underground. And the shadow creature wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible in the infrared flash, were dozens more. An entire army of things that shouldn't exist, making their way up from whatever lay beneath the Nevada desert. The paranormal detector was screaming now, its needle pinned to the maximum reading as waves of supernatural energy washed over me. But more importantly, I could hear sounds coming from the sinkhole with my naked ears. Not the scraping noises I'd heard earlier, but voices. Human voices, speaking in unison, chanting something in a language that predated human civilization. The tall figures surrounding me were becoming more solid by the minute, their translucent outlines filling in with substance and detail. I could see their faces clearly now, sharp features that looked like someone had tried to carve human expressions from living shadow, eyes that reflected light like polished obsidian, and those impossibly wide smiles that showed rows of teeth that were definitely not human. But they weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the sinkhole, and for the first time since I'd arrived at Desert Winds, I saw something other than predatory hunger in their expressions. They were afraid. Whatever was climbing up from the depths was something that even these apex predators didn't want to encounter. They were backing away from the containment barriers, their translucent forms flickering with what looked like panic. The radio crackled to life, but instead of Control's familiar voice, what came through the speakers was static mixed with the same chanting I could hear from the sinkhole. The professional anonymity was gone, replaced by barely controlled desperation. All units, this is Control. We have a code black situation at Desert Winds. Repeat, code black. Containment has been compromised. Emergency evacuation protocols are in effect immediately. Code black. I'd never heard the term before, but the meaning was clear from Control's tone. Whatever the barriers were designed to contain was getting loose. David, if you can hear this transmission, abort your current patrol immediately and proceed to the emergency extraction point. Do not attempt to investigate the containment breach. Do not attempt to reestablish barrier integrity. Your only priority is immediate evacuation. Emergency extraction point. I flipped through the rule packet frantically, looking for any mention of evacuation procedures or extraction points, but found nothing. The standard rules apparently didn't cover complete containment failure. The chanting from the sinkhole was getting louder, and I could see the glow from the barrier crystals beginning to flicker and fade. The mirrors were cracking, their reflective surfaces spiderwebbing with fracture lines, and several of the ritual objects had fallen from their posts entirely. But it was the sound of concrete cracking that made me realize just how dire the situation had become. The reinforced walls of the sinkhole were beginning to give way under pressure from below. Chunks of concrete and rebar were falling into the depths, and I could see hairline cracks spreading outward from the opening like a spider web across the desert floor. The tall figures around me were retreating now, their translucent forms fading as they put distance between themselves and whatever was rising from the underground complex. But as they backed away, they revealed something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone at the containment site. Standing on the opposite side of the sinkhole, clearly visible in the failing light of the barrier system, was a human figure. Not one of the translucent entities that had been stalking me all night, but a real person wearing the same uniform I'd been given when I started the job. It was the previous night caretaker. He looked exactly like the man in the Polaroid photographs pinned to the office corkboard, but older and more weathered, as if he'd been standing guard at this spot for years instead of days. His clothes were faded and torn. His skin had the leathery texture of someone who'd spent too much time in the desert sun, and his eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. But he was alive, and he was beckoning for me to join him. I started to walk around the perimeter of the sinkhole toward him, but as I moved, the paranormal detector's screaming reached a new level of intensity. The needle was vibrating so violently it was barely readable, and the device itself was getting hot in my hands. The previous caretaker raised his hand in a stopping gesture, then pointed urgently towards something behind me. I turned to see what he was indicating, and what I saw made me understand why evacuation was the only option. The desert floor between me and the office was buckling and heaving, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. Cracks were spreading outward from the sinkhole in all directions, and steam was beginning to rise from the fissures. The entire underground complex was collapsing, and the surface installations were going down with it. But more than that, things were emerging from the cracks. Not the shadow creatures I'd seen in photographs, but other entities. Things with too many legs and eyes in the wrong places. Things that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of different animals. Things that definitely hadn't evolved on the same planet as humanity. The chanting from the sinkhole had reached a crescendo, and now I could see its source. The desperate faces I'd seen trapped in various locations throughout the park were rising from the depths, but they weren't desperate anymore. They were part of the chanting. Their voices joined in whatever ritual had been building all night. And at the center of it all, climbing the last few feet of the spiral staircase carved into the sinkhole's walls, was something that made every other horror of the night seem trivial by comparison. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, and it moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been bound by the laws of physics. Its form shifted constantly, sometimes appearing almost human, sometimes looking like a living shadow with too many arms, sometimes resembling something that might have been worshipped by civilizations that had been extinct for millions of years. But it was its eyes that truly terrified me. Dozens of them, scattered across its shifting form like stars in a night sky, all focused on me with the patient attention of something that had been waiting a very long time for this moment. The previous night caretaker was shouting something, but his words were lost in a cacophony of chanting and cracking concrete. He was pointing frantically toward the desert, away from the park, gesturing for me to run. But I was frozen in place, mesmerized by the impossible sight of something that shouldn't exist climbing out of a hole that wasn't supposed to be there. The paranormal detector in my hands was smoking now, its circuits overloaded by levels of supernatural energy that exceeded its design parameters. The radio crackled one more time, and Control's voice cut through the chaos with crystal clarity. "David, you have 30 seconds before complete containment failure. The extraction helicopter is waiting at coordinates you will find in your emergency packet. If you're still in the park when that thing reaches the surface, there won't be anything left of you to extract. Emergency packet." I patted down my pockets and found an envelope I'd never noticed before, sealed with the same red wax as the Delta 7 instructions. Inside was a simple map showing a landing zone half a mile east of the park, along with coordinates and a single line of text: "Run now." The massive entity was almost at surface level now, its form blocking out the stars as it rose from the depths. The chanting had stopped, replaced by a sound that I can only describe as reality tearing. The air itself was rippling around the creature like heat mirages, and I could taste copper and ozone and something else, something that reminded me of the smell of old graves. I started running. Behind me, I could hear the final collapse of the containment system, concrete exploding, metal screaming as it was torn apart, and underneath it all, a sound like thunder made of malevolent intelligence. The thing was free, and it was aware of my existence. The paranormal detector in my hand finally gave up entirely, its circuits frying with a shower of sparks and a puff of acrid smoke. But I didn't need it to tell me that I was being chased. I could feel the creature's attention like a weight on my back, could sense its alien thoughts probing at the edges of my consciousness. The desert floor was breaking apart behind me as I ran, cracks spreading outward from the park like the shock waves of an earthquake. Steam and stranger things were rising from the fissures, and in the distance I could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. But it was the sunrise that saved me. As the first rays of actual sunlight crested the eastern mountains, the creature behind me let out a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part something that hurt to hear. The oppressive, supernatural atmosphere that had dominated the night began to dissipate, and I could feel the thing's attention pulling away from me as it retreated from the approaching dawn. The helicopter was waiting at the coordinates exactly as promised, its rotors spinning up as soon as I stumbled into the landing zone. As the crew pulled me aboard, I looked back toward Desert Winds RV Park and saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The entire complex was gone, not destroyed, not collapsed, but simply absent. Where the park had been was nothing but empty desert, as if it had never existed at all. No buildings, no RV pads, no sinkhole, no evidence that anything had ever been built there. But standing at the edge of where the park used to be, clearly visible in the morning sunlight, was the previous night caretaker. He raised his hand in what might have been a farewell, and then he faded away like morning mist. The helicopter crew was professional and efficient, but I could see the relief in their eyes as we lifted off and headed towards civilization. This wasn't their first extraction from Desert Winds, and it probably wouldn't be their last. During the flight, one of the crew members handed me a thick envelope marked debriefing materials and a check for an amount that was exactly what I'd been promised for 1 week of work. Inside the envelope was a standard non-disclosure agreement, a business card for a psychiatric counseling service, and a single sheet of paper with a brief message. Thank you for your service at Desert Winds RV Park. Your employment has been terminated due to facility closure. All records of your employment and activities at the facility have been classified and are not subject to public disclosure. Any attempt to discuss your experiences at Desert Winds with unauthorized personnel will result in immediate legal action and potential criminal prosecution. Your replacement orientation is scheduled for next Tuesday at 2,300 hours. Replacement orientation. Someone else was going to take the job I just escaped from. Someone else was going to read those impossible rules and think they could handle whatever Desert Winds had waiting for them. But as we flew east toward Las Vegas and the promise of normal human civilization, I realized that I understood something the next caretaker wouldn't. The rules weren't designed to protect you from the supernatural entities that inhabited the park. They were designed to keep you alive long enough to serve as bait for something much worse. The check in my hand was payment for 1 night of work as a human lure, keeping the attention of lesser horrors distracted while something ancient and patient worked its way up from the depths of the Nevada desert. And somewhere in a government office or corporate boardroom, people in expensive suits were already planning how to contain it again. Desert Winds RV Park would be rebuilt in a new location, with new rules and new caretakers, and the same impossible job posting that had seemed like salvation when I was desperate enough to take it. And eventually, someone else would accept that job, just like I had. Someone who needed the money badly enough to ignore all the red flags. Someone who would follow the bizarre rules, because the alternative was homelessness and starvation. But now, flying toward a world where the strangest thing you might encounter was a difficult customer or a broken coffee machine, I couldn't shake the memory of those desperate faces trapped in infrared photographs, all holding signs that read, "Help US." Because I was beginning to suspect that every person who had ever worked at Desert Winds was still there, in some form, still following the rules, still conducting their patrols, still serving as bait for things that should never have been allowed to exist. And somewhere in the Nevada desert, a new abandoned RV park was already under construction, complete with impossible rules and a sinkhole that definitely wasn't what it appeared to be. The cycle would continue, because apparently there were some jobs that humanity needed done, no matter how terrible the cost. I just pray that whoever takes my place is smart enough to run when they get the chance. Because in the end, the most important rule at Desert Winds RV Park was the one they never wrote down. Some paychecks aren't worth cashing, no matter how desperate you are.